Hello and welcome once again. This is Jennifer McGuire and I'm glad you're here. Today I'm sharing with you lots of tips and techniques for using embossing powders. I will be focusing on basic embossing powders such as clear, white, and gold so that we can find new ways to use them and get better results. Some of my tips are very basic, but sometimes I think it's good to look at those basics in order to get better results. And then some of my tips are a little more creative on how you can use different products together. Now, all of my cards today use backgrounds that I created in my previous video. If you have not seen that video, I do recommend you going and watching that so you can see how all of these backgrounds were made. So today I'm just putting the cards together and adding heat embossing. If you want to check out that video, it'll be linked here on the top right and also near the top of my description below. But today we're focusing on the heat embossing. Let's first go over some basic tips of heat embossing, just to kind of reiterate some of the things that I think are helpful, and also talk about white heat embossing and black heat embossing. Okay, so this is the first background that I'm going to use on a card. I created this one, as I mentioned in the last video, using a magic inking technique. It was just Versamark ink, a background stamp, a stencil, and some colorful dye ink. I will simply be stamping an image over this and heat embossing to help it stand out a bit. This is the Simon Says Stamp Floral Garden stamp. This is great. It's 6x8, so you could use this image on large slimline 5x7 cards, but I'm using a traditional card size today. Okay, so I have this inky background and I want to be sure that it is completely dry. One of the ways I like to test it before heat embossing is just putting embossing powder on it. If it sticks, I need to be sure to really heat set it and use an anti-static powder tool. Well, I just tested it and had no problem, so I'll just use my anti-static powder tool and we can start our stamping and heat embossing. I'm using my Misty stamping tool simply because it's handy, and I'm stamping this large image on top with black ink. Now, instead of just leaving it plain black ink, I'm going to heat emboss it so it stands out a bit more against this colorful background. When I want black heat embossing, what I choose to do is use a black pigment ink and then do clear embossing on top of it. I have a hard time with black embossing powder. It can be kind of messy. So I find this is the best way to get really good results for a black heat embossed image. I prefer Altenew Obsidian Black Pigment Ink. It is great, nice and crisp, and wonderful for heat embossing, but you could just air dry it if you want. So because I am heat embossing this, it'll stand out more on our colorful background. So I could have left this just a black image, but the clear embossing really makes it catch the eye more. By the way, the clear embossing powder I used there is Hero Art's Ultrafine Clear Embossing Powder. I've simply used it for years, but most clear embossing powders are very similar, so you can use what you have. I will link to all of the basic embossing powders that I choose down in my YouTube description below. Okay, now for a sentiment on this. I used the Simon Says Stamp XL Greetings 2 bundle. This is a great large stamp set with bold sentiments that fill a card nicely. And I love that there are coordinating dies available so you can cut them out and easily add them onto your card. So I chose a sentiment from this and I decided I wanted to white heat emboss on black cardstock. When using white embossing powder on black cardstock, it really is important to use that anti-static powder tool. I like to use an anti-static powder bag, and I just fold it in half and put a binder clip on it so it's easy to hold on to. It makes it easy to apply the powder. I learned this trick from my friend Ricky, and I will link to his channel up here on the top right too. So there's my anti-static powder tool. You'll be able to see the powder on my black cardstock, but that's okay. I'll show you how I remove it later. I'm inking this up with Versamark ink, which is my ink of choice for a clear embossing ink. It's just clear and sticky, but any embossing ink would work. Now I'm adding on my white embossing powder. Notice I lay my paper flat and pour the powder on it. That way it gets into all the nooks and crannies of the ink, and I can be sure I have good coverage. I then kind of tap off the excess so that I can heat set it. An anti-static powder bag will be sure that you get a really crisp results without any stray embossing. All right, so now that I have that heat set, you can still see that anti-static powder tool. What I do is I take 2 quick swipes of a baby wipe and it wipes it off, and it gives me a nice crisp white heat embossed image on black cardstock. By the way, the black cardstock that I used there was Tim Holtz alcohol ink cardstock. It is a black matte cardstock that is just beautiful. And I used Gina K Ultrafine White Embossing Powder. That gives really great crisp results. For clear and white, I do choose to use an ultrafine embossing powder just so that when I do sentiments, I can be sure they're nice and crisp. As for favorite brands of embossing powders, there are many good ones out there, and a lot come from the same manufacturer. But if you are looking for really unique embossing powders, I recommend Wow and Brutus Monroe. They have a lot of really unique ones. But today I'm focusing on basics, such as the clears and the whites. Now, before we move on to the next example, I did want to rewind and show this one clip again. I do keep my basic embossing powders in a large container, and I have a little triangle bead tray in there that it helps me to put that powder onto the project. It just works really well and I find it handy, but you could use a little spoon, a little piece of cardstock, whatever you have. But for my basics, I do have a triangle tray in there that really helps out. Okay, so I have some more basic tips, but let's start doing more examples where we kind of step it up, and I can share the basic tips along the way. My first example here is to create a thick heat embossed image. By creating thick embossing, you get more dimension and more shine, and it stands out even more. So I'm starting with this dot background. It's kind of similar to the one I used before, but in this case, I had used white pigment ink, a background stamp, a stencil, and some dye ink. Again, this is from that magic inking technique video. I did trim the background down, so I have 2 pieces, one that I'll use on this card and one that I'm saving for a future card. I really like this background, so I didn't want to add too much to it. I'll just add a basic sentiment in the center, but I want to make it special, so I'll do thick embossing on it so it stands out even more. Okay, so I have my Misty stamping tool using my anti-static powder tool as I always do. And I'm using that Altenew Obsidian Black pigment ink. It is excellent, again, for embossing black images. So I stamped that once, and I want to get a good amount of ink down. I might as well just go ahead and stamp it again. Then I will add my clear embossing powder. Again, this is from Hero Arts, but any clear embossing powder would work. Now, once I have put a coat on, I will go ahead and heat set it. Now, you could stop here, but if you've ever looked closely at a heat embossed image, sometimes it's a little bumpy and it has like a textured look to it. Sometimes that's good, but I really wanted this to stand out and have shine to it, and really a look of dimension. Okay, so watch this. While my embossing powder is hot and melted right now, I'm going to quickly add another layer of embossing powder to it. The melted embossing powder grabs the fresh powder we put on top, and then I can heat set it again, and that gives us 2 layers. So our embossing powder is getting thicker. Now, there are thick embossing powders out there. However, I find this just as easy to do, and then you don't have to buy another product. So I did it again there while my embossing powder was hot. I shook on another layer of powder, and then I will heat set that. So I have 3 layers on here, and it really does make a significant difference in real life. It makes the letters look domed. It looks like you covered it with glossy accents. So here's a comparison. On the left is 1 layer of embossing powder. On the right is 3 layers. You can see kind of the bumpy look to the one on the left, and then the one on the right is really smoothed and raised. It's hard to capture in the video, but in real life you can feel that texture, and it is super cool. So I like to do that whenever I have a bold sentiment like this one that I really want to have stand out. Okay, so now I'm just assembling this into a mini slimline card. The final size of this card will be 6 by 3¼ inches. I buy my mini slimline envelopes on Simon Says Stamp. I'll put a link below, and I really am enjoying the small size of card. Okay, next I wanted to add some simple embellishments. I love the color in the background of this, but I thought it'd be fun to add a few little black stars. So I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Mini Stars Party Die. That's the die over there on the left. This allows you to cut a bunch of stars at once of 3 different sizes. Now you could use it as a little backdrop on your card, but I like to use it to quickly cut a bunch of accents for my card. You can see the original mini heart party die up there at the top, which I use a lot in videos, and now there's a stars. So I cut these from black cardstock from Tim Holtz. That's my favorite matte black cardstock to use for embellishments and sentiments. And I just added a few stars here and there. Notice I am putting glue on top of the stars. That's because I'm layering these up. That's another way to make your details on your card stand out, especially when the design is simple like this. So each of those stars are 3 stars thick. I just glued them together for a stacked look. I also keep the extra stars in a little bowl with my extra hearts. You can see up there at the top. These are great to have on hand whenever I just want to add a tiny accent to my project. Once I've completed my layered stars, I covered it with a bit of Aqua Shimmer pen, which by the way is back in stock. I'm so excited. And that gives my stars some shimmer. Then on top of that, I'm adding some mini glossy accents. You could have used clear embossing on some black cardstock and then die cut it to get shiny stars. But I just find with little pieces like this, it's easier just to add a little bit of glossy accents on top for some shine. So the glossy accents on the stars will have that clear domed look that's very similar to the sentiment that we did with our layers of heat embossing. And it really just pulls together this very simple card and gives it a nice finished look. So I encourage you to try layering embossing powders. It makes a big difference. And you can even do it with the specialty embossing powders too. Now, I don't do layering of embossing powders on small images, such as small sentiments, because it's not very noticeable. But it works great on bold sentiments or images, and you'll see some more examples of that in today's video. By the way, I also did add some little bubble accents in the background. They're clear with a little bit of iridescent color to them, just to add some shine. I also stamped I Adore You on the inside of the card, and that is from the Simon Says Stamp Inside Family Messages stamp set. There are great sentiments in there for family, but also for friends, and I'll be using these on the inside of most of my cards today. Okay, my next idea for you is to do layered embossing, but with multiple colors of embossing powder. I still use some basic powders here, at least they're basic to me because I use them often and ones that I recommend. First of all, here's the background that I'm doing. It was one of my favorites from the last video. This, again, was created with the magic inking technique. So I wanted a lot of this to show, so I kept the die cuts I put on top basic with white, silver, and black. Okay, so here is the background die that I'm using. It's the Simon Says Stamp Sweet Garden Cherry Tree die. I like this so much, I used it for this card and my next two, but I'll change the look up on the third one. So I die cut that 3 times from white cardstock, and from 2 of them, I'm cutting quite a bit off the edge. These will be stacked behind the main die cut just to give it some dimension. You can skip this if you want to. So you can see I'm cutting quite a bit off of each edge. Now on the third die cut, I'm only cutting a little bit off each edge. That way when I glue this 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch die cut on a note card, you'll see a little trim of the note card around it. Again, this cuts full card size. Okay, so now I'm gluing those 3 die cuts together. I'm using Honeybee Precision Glue today. Any strong liquid glue would be fine. And I'm gluing these together, and this will really kind of stand out against that soft background that I created in the last video. Okay, so now we can glue this on, and notice I still have that scrap up there in the top left, and I'm saving that for another card. I may do a video where I mix and match scraps from different techniques together on a card, so stay tuned for that. Okay, I wanted to add something special to those flowers, so this is where I'm doing some layered heat embossing. For this, I'm using a stamp set that coordinates with that background die. There's actually 2 stamp sets that do. The one on the left is the Sweet Garden Bloom stamp set, and the one on the right is the Sweet Garden Birds stamp set. Both of them have coordinating die sets. On this card, I'm using the stamp set on the right. It has the flowers that line up nicely with the die cut that we're using. Now, I will use both of these stamp sets later on again in this video. But for this, I just took out the 2 flowers that line up with our background stamp, and I put them in my Misty stamping tool along with white cardstock. I'm stamping them with Versamark ink, and then I'm rotating my paper and stamping again. and rotating and stamping again until I have those images in all 4 corners. This is just a fast way to stamp a bunch at once, and I'll show you another trick with it too. Now I'm adding Hero Art's White Satin Pearl Embossing Powder. This is a favorite embossing powder of mine. I use it a lot and consider it a basic, but you could use white embossing powder here if you prefer. This embossing powder has a pearly shine to it and picks up whatever color's behind it, in this case just white. Some people like to heat their embossing powder from the back side of the paper. Sometimes it gives a little bit smoother results, but not always, so you can try it out. I usually don't do that. But you can see that the first layer is a little bit bumpy, a little textured, so I want to smooth that out. So I'm putting this back into my stamping tool, and right on top of the first layer, I'm stamping again with Versamark ink. So you can stamp with the Versamark ink right on top of the heat embossing that's already done. Just make sure it's cool. Now that I have more Versamark ink on there, I can add more embossing powder. So last time I added layers by putting it on the hot powder. But I had a lot of images here, so it was easier to stamp again with Versamark ink on top, add more powder, and heat set it. So I have 3 layers of embossing powder on here, and this makes a huge difference with this. You'll see that the images are smooth and they're raised, and it has this beautiful shine to it. You can do this with any embossing powders you have. I just happen to use this pearl a lot because it adds such gorgeous shine. Now this flower has a layering image, so this adds just some detailed lines to the center of the flower. So I'm lining them up with the embossed images we already have, using my anti-static powder tool, stamping with Versamark ink right on top of it, and doing this on each. Now this time I will use a different embossing powder. I'm going to use Hero Art's Silver Glitter Embossing Powder, or Sparkle Embossing Powder. That's another basic of mine that I use quite often. I don't like to use it for fine detailed sentiments, but larger ones it's great because it does have that glitter in it. And you'll see me use it again in my next example. But I heat set that, and look at that powder melts into the surface of the embossing powder we already have, and it gives a smooth look with the silver just kind of embedded in it. And it's super cool and a great way to use any 2 embossing powders together. This is also a fun way to use your layered stamps, and I'll link to a video where I show that technique up here on the top right. Okay, now I have the little coordinating dies for these flowers. So I'm lining it up on one of the first sets I stamped. And once I have it lined up, I'll use some temporary tape to hold it down and to hold the 2 dies together. Once I run it through, those 2 dies are still connected, and I can move it easily to the other, and I don't have to spend as much time lining the dies up. Okay, so now we can add these to our background. So I'm just gluing them right on top. They line up on there perfectly. I could have just stamped directly on that background die, but this was easier and still gave me more dimension. Okay, next I have the Miss You So Much sentiment. That's from that XL greeting stamp set I showed you at the beginning. And I did do black ink with 3 layers of clear embossing powder on top. Then I used the coordinating die to cut it out. I wanted some dimension behind that, but notice it does go over the dimension of the tree branch. So here's the trick I did. I die cut 2 of the coordinating die cuts and glued them together, but I cut off the bottom. So see how the bottom of that is cut off? Now I'll put glue on top of that. Again, those are 2 stacked. Glue that behind our main one. Then we can add this to the card, and there's not too much dimension there under the word much because that's going to overlap with our branch. I like stacking up cardstock instead of using foam dots. If I used foam squares behind the sentiment, it would probably get squished in the mail and kind of give it a bended look on the sentiment. I really want that to stand out nicely. Now I finished that off by adding some silver gemstones to the center of the flowers. I thought that went nicely with the silver embossing powder. And then also some pool colored pearls around it in the sky. Now notice that layered embossing. It has a really smooth look, but we have the pearl flower with the silver embossing details at the center. Now you could do something more subtle, maybe do pearl embossing powder with a white for the details, or you could do colored embossing powders for this. Sky is the limit. Okay, my next idea for using embossing powders is to do a faux metallic embellishment. See that hello die cut? It looks like a metal sparkly die cut, but really it's just white cardstock with embossing powder. So I used the Simon Says Stamp CZ Design Hello die set. I've used this one many times. You have the word hello and the shadow die. Now I die cut from some white cardstock, and for some reason I had a lot of little hairs around the edge of my die cut. This is how I remove them. I just press tape on the front and the back of it, and then you'll see all the little hairs are on the tape and removed from the die cut. So if you ever have that happen, that's a quick and easy tip. So I die cut 3 white hello die cuts and glued them together. You could use up any scraps you want here, any colors, or even mess up cardstocks, because nobody will see it. We're going to cover it with embossing powder. So I'm gluing these 3 together, and this will give my faux metallic die cut more dimension, but you could definitely do 1 layer if you prefer. Okay, so now I have a piece of scrap cardstock that I'm putting a little bit of tape on, or adhesive, so I can hold my die cut. So this is just a handle so I don't burn my fingers. I then will take my Versamark ink pad and press it right on top. So I'm just pressing it pretty generously on top of the die cut to cover it. Now that'll make it clear and sticky, and I can add my Hero Arts Silver Sparkle Embossing Powder. You could use a regular silver or gold metallic embossing powder. Doesn't have to have the glitter. In fact, I think it actually looks better without the glitter because it gets really smooth and rounded. But I really wanted this to have that sparkle to match our flowers. So I put 1 layer on, and there you can see what it looks like. It's not that impressive yet, but when I add 2 more layers, it'll really look cool. So I let that cool completely. Then I pressed on more Versamark ink, add another layer, heat set that, and then repeat that process. So I end up with 3 layers on there. Always be sure they're cooled between each embossing before you add the next layer of Versamark ink. Okay, so now we have this faux metallic looking word. It has a little bit of a rounded look to it. See how it catches that light nicely? And it also has the sparkle in it. If you want the results to be super smooth, just use a regular silver embossing powder. Now I can glue this onto the white shadow die cut that the die set came with, and then add it to our card. So this design is very similar to the last one. However, I turned it sideways so I would have a landscape card. Again, it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. On top of our hello, I stamped Sweet Friend on a cardstock strip just to give it a little more detail. You can see how the silver sparkle embossing powder on the die cut matches the details in our flowers and kind of pulls it all together. But this still lets that bold background show through and be really the focal point of the card. Now that Sweet Friend is from the Simon Says Stamp Clean Line Gratitude stamp set that I seem to reach for a lot. All right, I have 1 more using that background die, but I change it up this time. And with this example, I show how to create a faux glitter paper die cut. This is a great way to create your own glitter paper, and it doesn't rub off. So let's first start with the background of the card. I did the same thing I did with the last 2 cards. I cut 3 die cuts, but this time I cut the flowers off of it. So I just have the frame with the tree branch on it. That way I could add my own flowers and leaves for a different look. Or you could do a winter card where you don't add anything and maybe put a cardinal in it. Always think of ways to take your die cuts and alter them a bit for different looks. So I have this Spellbinders Mini Blooms and Sprigs die set. Now, there are many different little flower and leaf sets out there. I just had this one on my desk, so I decided to use it. And I just die cut a bunch of flowers and leaves from white cardstock, and I'll add those in place on the card of the ones we cut off. On the bottom right there, you can see the Memory Box Birthday Mail Posh Script die set. You've got the words birthday mail and then the shadow die, and that's what I'll be using for our technique. So I die cut the words birthday mail and glued 3 layers together, and this is a teal cardstock. I temporarily adhered it to a piece of scrap paper, and on it I'm adding a Judican Sparkle embossing powder. There are so many great sparkle embossing powders out there. This is just one that I've had for years and used for years, and it works great. But just any sparkle embossing powder would work. I let that cool, pressed my Versamark ink pad on top, and added another layer. Now you could do 2 or 3 layers or even 1 if you prefer, but I always think more is better. Then I added it onto its shadow. So this has the look of glitter paper, but I was able to pick a custom color, and this won't rub off. And if you want a big piece, you could just press Versamark ink pad onto your cardstock all over it, add sparkle embossing powder all over it, and then die cut it. Either way works. You can see the flowers and leaves that I put on the background. It would be fun to do a card that's like fall theme, spring, summer, winter, using this one background die, really giving it a lot of life. Now keep in mind, I'm using a lot of word dies for examples or word die cuts, but you could cover any die cut or any background with embossing powder to give the faux metallic or faux glitter paper a look. Okay, my next idea is to create the look of colored embossing powders without the need to have a bunch of colors. I purged a lot of my color embossing powders a few years ago, and this is a great way to get the look when you want it. So here's a background I did with that awesome Simon Says Stamp Painted Flowers Wreath stencil. My next card uses this too. And again, I did that background in my last video, so you can watch that if you want. Now I wanted to add that Sweet Garden bird stamp set that I showed you earlier. So here's what I did. I have the negative space of my die cuts, and I'm lining up the stamps for it. I just needed this one bird and wing for now. I'm popping the die cuts in and then stamping on them. I just find this easy to do when I've got a lot of die cutting. Okay, so I'm stamping this with a dye ink, and this is Hero Art Soft Pull. I decided it was too light, so I switched out to a Lawn Fawn Mermaid, and I just stamped that on top, so you can see it got darker there. I wanted to have a little variation in that, so I'm adding a darker blue ink. This is a Gina K Mermaid Lagoon, and I'm adding it towards the bottom of the stamp only using my Gina K blending brush. Any blending brush will work, but I'm applying this darker ink only on part of it and kind of blending it up. So when I stamp it, you can see the belly of the bird and the tips of the wings are a bit darker. This is a great way to take a solid image and add a little bit of interest to it. Okay, so next I added some details from the stamp set. There is this little cluster of flowers, which I stamped with white pigment ink on his belly. And then I stamped the little eyes and beak with black pigment ink. Any ink would work there. You could use dye ink. Now I could leave this as is, but I wanted that bird to stand out on this colorful background. So I wanted it to have some shine. However, I used dye inks, and dye inks dry very quickly. I could have used pigment inks, but I don't have many pigment inks on hand anymore. Since this is already dry, what I'll do is I'll stamp right on top of my colored stamping with Versamark ink. So my stamps are still in the Misty stamping tool. I clean the stamps off. I'm using Versamark ink, which is clear and sticky, and stamping right on top of this stamping we've already done. Now our images are sticky. If you have pigment inks, you could just use those, colored pigment inks. I just didn't have them in these colors. So I just stamped with dye inks, then Versamark ink, and added clear embossing powder. Another option is to just use color embossing powders from the beginning, but as I mentioned, I don't have many colors. So I have mostly dye inks, and that's what most stampers have. So I wanted to show you can use those and still get a nice embossed image. And I did 2 layers of clear embossing on there, so it would be nice and smooth and lots of shine. You can also see the shine on the bird and how it makes it stand out against that background. Now I also added You Make Life Beautiful on a sentiment strip underneath, and that is from the Simon Says Stamp You Got This stamp set. And I added some yellow pearls. I did trim my background down and put it onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. So with this example, I wanted to show that you could create the look of colored embossed images just by using dye inks, Versamark ink, and clear embossing. Okay, my next idea is to mix different powders together to get a really cool look on an image. This is most impactful if you use 2 different colors of embossing powder, like maybe blue and yellow, but I wanted to stick with basics today, so I'll demonstrate it with silver and clear. So I'm starting by stamping my image with black obsidian ink. So this is a black pigment ink. If you don't have a good black pigment ink, I highly recommend getting one. It's the best way to get a black heat embossed image. Okay, now I'm taking Hero Art's silver embossing powder and sprinkling a little bit of it here and there onto the wet ink. You could use any embossing powders here once again. You can even mix multiples together. But I'm only putting a bit of the silver down in different areas. So I'm not sprinkling it over the whole thing. I then flip it over, knock off the excess, and now I cover the whole thing with clear embossing powder. That way, when I heat set it, we'll have some silver and some clear. It'll be hard to see in the video, but in real life, it does capture the light nicely. You know how when you do silver embossing, it looks a little darker when you tilt it one way and a little bit more bright when you tilt it another? Well, you get that in some areas of this image, which really looks cool. Now, if you want to, you could leave it as is, but I really like to add that extra layer of embossing powder when I have a bold sentiment like this. So I heated it up so it was hot, added more powder, and then melted it. And that gives us an even smoother look. That time I didn't add more silver, just more clear. So I added all my pieces onto a blue note card, and I kept this card very simple from there because there are lots of details in our background and in that sentiment. So here when I tilt it in the light, you can kind of see how some areas it's black, because that's where we use the clear embossing powder, and in some areas it's silver, and it really gives this kind of molten look that is super cool. So I encourage you to try this with any two embossing powders you have. Really, the more contrast between the two, the better, but this worked really well for this particular card. Okay, my next idea is to do an embossing impression. This is an old technique that I've done in videos way long ago, but I haven't done recently, so I thought I'd include it. For this, we're going to create kind of our own chipboard piece and then do an impression in our hot embossing powder. So I used my Hero Arts Infinity heart dies, and I die cut a few hearts that already have Altenew double-sided adhesive sheet on the back. That just makes it really easy to glue each of these layers together. The reason I'm putting multiple layers together is I want to kind of create a chipboard or thick piece of cardstock to do this technique on. I don't want warping to happen, and this will prevent it. Okay, so then I end up with this layered heart, and I have adhesive on one side. And I'm putting gold embossing powder right onto that adhesive. I could have instead just pressed my Versamark ink pad onto the heart, then put the gold embossing powder. Either option works. So you'll see this is kind of bumpy and not very smooth. That's a good example of a time where it's best to add more layers. I let it cool, press more Versamark ink on it, and here I thought I was going to try a rose gold embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp. I first did the gold, changed my mind, then I did this, changed my mind, and then I'll change it again. So you'll see that you can build up layers of embossing powder and it's fine. With this technique, you want many layers of embossing powder. I ended up with the Lawn Fawn Rose Gold, and that seemed to match my background the best. So I'm doing lots of layers of this. While it's hot, I'll pour on more layers. I end up doing between 6 and 8 layers of embossing powder for this technique. Next, I have a wood-mounted rubber stamp. This is new from Simon Says Stamp. It's a butterfly, and I'm inking it up with Versamark ink, and it's just going to sit there for a second. I then am going to heat up all of that embossing till it's nice and melted. Then I'm quickly going to take that stamp that has Versamark ink on it and press it in to that melted embossing powder. I'll just set it there. I'm not pressing firmly. I'm kind of laying it into it, and I'll just leave it there for a few minutes. The embossing powder will take the shape of that stamp. Don't worry, the embossing powder won't damage your wood-mounted rubber stamp. Rubber stamps are the best and they hold up to anything. So now check this out. I carefully peel it off and we have that bird impression. That's not a bird. That butterfly impression into our embossing. I do like to just give it a little bit of a heat gun, just a little bit to smooth the edges, but not too much that you lose your impression. And check that out. Super cool way to use your stamps. Okay, so I added that to a very simple card. I have one of my backgrounds from the last video, and then I added a Simon Says Stamp stitched banner die right down the center. And I stamped Thanks, which is from the Flower Garden background stamp that I used at the beginning of this video. I encourage you to try this technique. It might take a couple practice runs to make sure you get the right pressure and the right amount of layers, but it's a fun way to use any embossing powders. I don't recommend using glitter for it because it kind of muddles up the impression that you make, but any metallic or solid color embossing powder works wonderfully. All right, my final technique, and one that I forget about a lot but really works well, is to use your embossing powder for embossed details. So for this card, I have used the Sweet Garden Bloom stamp set that I showed you earlier. It has these really simple to assemble stamped images to create these little flower clusters. And I did 2 of them just using basic dye inks. I didn't do embossing on top of this, but I definitely could have if I wanted to. Now, normally when I have little images like this, I would add little pearls to it for some detail, but you can also use your embossing powder. And actually, you can use your embossing powder with liquid glue. Here I'm using my Honey Bee precision glue. You can use a glue pen, that works great too. And I'm putting dots at the center of my flowers. On those bigger flowers, I put bigger dots. On the smaller ones, I put smaller dots. And then I'm putting my white embossing powder on it. However, I'm not going to heat set it yet. I'm going to set it aside until that glue is dry. If you do it now, your glue kind of might bubble and ruin it. It looks better if you just leave it and let it dry. I assembled my card without touching those dots because they still are wet. I was really careful. And then I'm adding even more glue with little lines onto the main flower. But this time, instead of adding white embossing powder, I'm adding that sparkle embossing powder. It's sparkle clear. So I'll end up with dimensional white dots at the center of my flowers, and I'll end up with glitter details on that main flower. It's fun to add these little details using your embossing powders. Definitely could use like Nouveau drops for the white, or I could use some pearls, but sometimes you want your embossing powder to match the details. In this case, I just use white and clear sparkle, but you could use gold metallic, you could use bright colors, whatever you want. Once the glue is dry, like an hour later, I heat set it and you get these nice round dimensional dots and you get the sparkle embossing powder on the flowers. You could also use a Versamark ink pen to do heat emboss details like this, but by using glue, you have it on hand and you can get dimension from it. So there you have it, some basic tips for heat embossing and some creative ways to use your basic embossing powders. Sometimes I think it's good to go back to those basics and just rethink them for your projects. I'd love to hear from you. Leave some comments below on which of these you like, which you have tried, which you plan to try. Also, if you're interested in any of the supplies, they are linked below in my YouTube description. I have a couple other videos here for you at the end that you can watch that also are about using embossing powders creatively. My blog is linked at the top right. Thank you for watching. Please hit subscribe if you haven't done so already and the notification bell. Take care. Have a great day. See you soon.